The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is John Kiriakou, the former CIA officer, counterterrorism expert, author, and whistleblower. You worked for the CIA from 1990 to 2004, notably as the chief of counter-terrorist operations in Pakistan due to the 9/11 terror attacks. Here, you refused to participate in the training of enhanced interrogation techniques, later identified as a torture program. In 2009, with an interview with ABC, you became the first former government official to confirm the use of waterboarding against al-Qaeda suspects. And in 2012, you were charged with leaking classified information to journalists and sentenced to 30 months in prison. As a result, you lost friendships, your job, and were vilified in the mainstream press. Today, you focus on fighting for human rights and supporting those that face similar consequences, and you ultimately believe there are things we should never do, even in the name of national security, and the US government should stop participating in immoral and unethical practices. John, welcome to London Real.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Looking forward to jumping into it. I think you once said, I'm a patriot. I love my country. I want it to succeed, but I think it's making a lot of mistakes. And I'd love to get your opinion on kind of what's happening in the world. I think I'll start off with a situation that's close to home over here, and that's the war in Ukraine. And I was just wondering, what is your take on what's happening there? We're 500 some days into it. Mm-hmm. The US is pumping tons of money, tons of weapons into that. We recently saw this Wagner quote unquote coup happen. You know, you work for Sputnik Radio, and so maybe you know a few things about Russia that we don't. What is your take on the situation as we see it now?
I've got a take that isn't terribly popular either at work or amongst my friends. My position is, look, if we're going to be supporters of peace, then we have to be supporters of peace. I understand why the Russian government took the decision to enter Ukraine. I understand that the United States was behind a coup, a soft coup in 2014. But if we're going to be peaceniks, then we have to oppose war, period. And so on the day of the invasion, I said on my radio show, which is on Sputnik Radio here in Washington, it's a Russian government-owned radio network. I said at the start of the show, I unequivocally oppose the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I urge Russian troops to leave Ukraine immediately. With that said, I equally strongly oppose US and NATO intervention in Ukraine. We told the Russian government repeatedly, and I'm talking about President Bill Clinton, President Barack Obama, we told them repeatedly that we would not support Ukrainian membership in NATO. And we never meant that. We were lying to them to placate them. And so knowing that that was a Russian red line, we did it anyway. And we started talking to the Ukrainian government about entering NATO. We promised the Russian government that we would not allow NATO to expand to its borders. And we did repeatedly with the Baltic states, for example, and Poland. So to then point the finger at the Russians and say, this is all a result of Russian hegemony, of Russian imperialism, is disingenuous. I think at the very least, everybody should be sitting at the table and we should be trying to negotiate a settlement to this thing.
Well, why do you think the Biden administration has seemed to go kind of all in on this war?
Yeah.
I mean, is it something as simple as, you know, it's easy to get reelected in wartime? As a matter of fact, I think there's almost like 100% correlation. Or is it much deeper? because they've really grabbed on to this. And, if it seems like one of their core platforms is that we are fighting for whatever reasons, and we're going to take this all the way. Not always the party of war in the past. And just curious on why you think they did that. And was it obvious they would do that from the start?
I think that's a very important question. And I think the answer is severalfold. Number one, yes, you're correct. I think this was a strategic re-election move. Number two, and I don't mean to sound cynical, but I really believe this. I think that Joe Biden, like every other president, is constantly thinking about his legacy. Every president, for better or worse, wants to be a wartime president, right? That's how you enter the history books, is as a wartime president. And we were pulling out of Afghanistan after 2 decades. We were pulling out of Iraq after nearly 2 decades. What better way to make a name for yourself for generations to come than to take on one of the world's greatest powers in Russia, and to do it for what you say is the right reasons. So I think that's a part of it as well. And one of the things that's utterly perplexing to me is what you've just alluded to, and that is the flip that we've seen in the Democratic Party, where the Democratic Party used to lead demonstrations in the streets in opposition, for example, to the Vietnam War. It was the Democrats who came out in opposition to the little tiny mini war that we had in Grenada in the early 1980s. The only opposition to the first Gulf War was among a handful of Democratic senators. It was only Democrats that opposed the second Iraq War. Well, what happened? Why are the Democrats all in? And they're all in without giving long-term thought to how exactly we're going to pay for all this. And what does victory look like? Nobody's ever actually quantified what that's going to be. At what point do we declare victory and go home? Is it the utter defeat of the Russian military? Because that's never going to happen. The Russian military is 20 times the size of the Ukrainian military, and it has nuclear weapons. So again, what is victory? I think we should begin to temper our expectations, and whether we like it at this early stage or not, get everybody to the negotiating table.
Yeah, what does victory look like? I think I had Colonel McGregor on a couple weeks ago, and he brought
he's great.
Yeah, he's fantastic. He brought that same question up, and you've heard it so many times throughout history. You asked that question about Vietnam. You asked that question about Iraq. You asked that question about Afghanistan. So many people have openly asked it. And yes, right now, here we are. And you're like, well, what the hell does victory look like? I bet you couldn't even get an answer from that out of DC. And you've got the Republican side, people like Donald Trump, which I guess 10 years ago, you'd think this guy, of course he would want war. He's saying, the crazy thing is both Donald Trump and RFK, and I know you've had conversations with him, and we have as well. Mm-hmm. They both said, I could end this war with a phone call, and it's over. First of all, do you think that's true, John? Do you think both of those guys could end it with a phone call?
That's a tough one. Perhaps. I hate to be wishy-washy. I apologize for that. It's possible. First of all, let me say Doug McGregor's a dear friend of mine, and I have absolutely deep respect for not just his knowledge and understanding of these complex issues, but for his willingness to go out on a limb, even when his positions are unpopular. We need more people like that in Washington, not fewer. Doug was supposed to be the U.S. ambassador to Germany, and the Republicans blocked his nomination. Now, how ridiculous is that? I don't want to get too far off topic, but I suppose it would be popular if the Russian side were able to trust an American leader. And I think that they would trust Donald Trump and Bob Kennedy on this issue. I think that could lead to some sort of a settlement. And how ironic is it? How odd is it that it's the Republicans who have begun saying, look, we can't afford this over the long term. This is not a cost that the American taxpayer should bear. This is not a war that we need to be involved in. It's a war of choice. Why aren't the Democrats saying that? Why do we have the likes of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez supporting supporting appropriations for continued war, or Bernie Sanders, or Elizabeth Warren? I just don't understand the role reversal that we've seen in this war. It doesn't make any kind of sense to me.
Yeah, and meanwhile, there's like hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dying.
Yes.
There's tons of money being pumped in, and I want to ask you about your theories on the wartime economy, because it comes up here for sure. And then on top of that, I don't know what you see in America, but here in the UK, you see a massive mainstream media bias towards Ukraine.
Oh my God.
Victor. I mean,
it's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous. And I pull up the Guardian and the Times, and then I look at the New York Times sometimes, occasionally, I still do. And I just look at it and I'm just like, guys, I mean, if there's any tiny little bit of victory, they magnify it from the Ukrainians. And if there's any tiny slip in the Russians, they magnify it. Luckily, I get to talk to like guys like Jim Rickards and Colonel McGregor, and they're like, look, this is not the truth on the ground. No. And if you know that, you look at the media, and even the media can't sell me on it. So why do you think that's happening? And what do you see? Do you see the same thing?
Oh, I absolutely see the same thing. And the worst offenders are the New York Times and the Washington Post. You just can't trust coverage in the New York Times and the Washington Post. Like you said, they'll take the smallest setback on the part of the Russians and blow it up to, the end of the war is at hand. They'll take the smallest victory by the Ukrainians and say that, this is David and Goliath. I can't tell you how many times I've seen that analogy. In fact, when the Ukrainians had set out to begin the counteroffensive, which was actually several weeks late, it was the Ukrainian military that predicted that by this point in the summer, they would have moved 60 miles inside Russian territory, and they would have divided the Russian military into two in Crimea. In fact, here we are months after the start of the counteroffensive. They've moved 5 miles inside Russian territory. They're nowhere near Crimea, and they have not split the Russian military. Well, that's a loss. That's not a victory. But what was the banner headline on the New York Times today? It was an analysis of how Vladimir Putin was almost overthrown in what they're now calling the Wagner coup. Well, there was no Wagner coup. It just never happened. It was an ill-fated march a third of the way to Moscow that the Russian government was able to negotiate out of, and the leader of this coup attempt has been exiled. So rather than to focus on made-up patriotic falsities, why don't we tell the truth, the real truth, and encourage an end to this conflict? Why do the major outlets in the American media have to be cheerleaders for American government policy? That just doesn't make any sense to me. It hasn't been like that in the past, at least not to this degree. But this is what we're up against, where you just can't find reliable news.
Yeah, I've had Seymour Hersh on here, who used to work for the Times. And now when he comes out with his theory on the Nord Stream bombing, which I might get your thoughts on, they won't even talk or print what he's referring to. And they make some other story up. And you spent a lot of time in the CIA, and about PSYOPs, and about surveillance. When you look at the New York Times, how do you explain that to yourself? Is there someone at the top that just says, we take the left narrative and we magnify it? It can't be that simple. Or do they really believe in what they're doing?
No, it's not that simple.
Okay.
Yeah, they do believe in what they're doing. And you know what? I'm going to answer your question with a short story. My last job at CIA headquarters was as the executive assistant to the CIA's deputy director for operations. Very important job, access to literally everything, and long, hard hours. So I had hit a lull in my day. My boss was off in a meeting, and I kind of kicked back in my chair like this, and I was looking out into the hallway, and I was just relaxing momentarily, looking out into the hallway, and Bob Woodward walked past my office. Bob Woodward being the famed, acclaimed Washington Post senior investigative reporter. And my brain didn't believe what my eyes had seen. So I said to the secretary, "Hey, was that Bob Woodward that just walked past the office?" And she said, "Yeah." I said, "Without a security escort, Bob Woodward is just walking the halls of CIA headquarters." And she said, "Oh, you didn't see the director's email?" And I said, "No." She said, "Yeah, they gave him free rein. He's writing a book, and we've all been ordered to cooperate with him." Well, I refused. I mean, like, one of the holy of holies at the CIA is that you never, ever talk to the media for any reason. Well, I came to learn that, of course, you talk to the media when you know the media are willing to carry your water for you. You know exactly who to leak to, and who you're going to leak to are Bob Woodward at the Washington Post, Joby Warrick at the Post, David Ignatius at the Post, and a half a dozen people at the New York Times. And then there are a couple of other people, you know, NBC News and the LA Times and Wolf Blitzer at CNN, because they're going to report exactly what you want them to report. So it's not as clear cut as most Americans believe. I'll give you another example. I was only on the job for a couple of weeks. This was in 1990, and I saw Wolf Blitzer walking the halls with a camera crew, no less, and no security escort. And he was doing a stand-up with his microphone right in front of a sign that said CIA Historical Intelligence Collection. It was an offshoot of the CIA library. And I remember looking at him and just shaking my head as I was walking out, like, well, somebody ought to be arrested for this. Probably Wolf Blitzer and the CIA security person who's not escorting him right now. And I walked out. But this kind of thing happens all the time. You know, we like to think that there's this Chinese wall between the CIA, and especially senior CIA officers, and the American media. And in fact, they're in bed together.
Wow. And it was funny because I talked to Seymour about his theory on the Nord Stream bombing. And then a couple weeks later, I saw the New York Times article again with this. I mean, when you hear the details that Seymour gives you, and then you see the New York Times article, it was this wacky theory about some Bulgarians that rented a boat and went down there. And I was just like, look, I'd never spent any time in CIA headquarters, but it didn't take an expert to realize that story sounded like somebody fed it to them.
Ridiculous.
And they just printed it up just to satisfy some things and just keep it moving. And it was just had a bunch of holes in it that even I could see from 1 hour with Seymour. So, but I guess the American public doesn't really know any better. They read it, they keep moving on. And so this is a psyops that works. You fool most of the people most of the time. And so it proceeds.
One of my closest friends used to be a boss of mine when I was on a 2-year rotation to the State Department. So he's a very senior former State Department official. In fact, I'm going to have dinner with him tonight. And when this explosion took place on the Nord Stream pipeline, I called him and I said, we had to have done this, right? I mean, it couldn't be anybody else. It had to be us. And he said, no, the Russians did it. And I said, you think the Russians blew up their own pipeline? What could they possibly have to gain by blowing up their own pipeline? Well, he said, it would be embarrassing for us. I said, Don, with all due respect, that doesn't make any kind of sense at all. And I talked to Cy Hirsch about it. And I said, this was us, right? And he said, well, it could be us. It could be the Ukrainians. And I said, yeah, if the Ukrainians had a mini sub that would allow them to go down there. But do they even have that kind of technology? I mean, we're the only ones that have that kind of technology that I know of. When I say we, I mean the United States and NATO. I just don't get what anybody else on the other side would have to gain from something like this. And sure enough, Cy was mostly right. If it wasn't us, it was the Ukrainians. We all suspected it, even though the mainstream media doesn't want to actually come out and say it. And let me add something about Cy Hirsch too. You know, this is a guy who, for the last 60 years, has been one of the most highly honored, highly awarded journalists in America. The guy was the definition of investigative journalism in the second half of the 20th century. And he literally cannot get published anymore. I'm a member of a group called Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. It's a group of retirees from the CIA, the FBI, NSA, and the US military. And we give an award every year called the Sam Adams Award for Integrity in Intelligence. We gave the award to Cy in 2017, and he complained then that he was under such pressure from the mainstream media here in the United States that the only place he could get his pieces published was in the London Review of Books, which is great. It's highly respected, but nobody reads the London Review of Books. They might have a few thousand subscribers. Now, here we are 5 years later, and he can't even get himself published in the London Review of Books. And so he's had to take to Substack to publish himself and to get the truth out there. That's how bad things have gotten here in the United States.
Yeah, if there was ever a perfect example, it's that. I mean, again, look at what he did with My Lai Massacre. I mean, this is a guy who had, he's shown that he has a commitment to journalism and to integrity enough to where, he was hated and vilified by the military, but he brings that same ethics to what he's doing today. And now that these same publications won't touch him. And it's like Cy hasn't changed. The media has, right?
Oh, you're exactly right.
Yeah.
The media has changed. We've changed as Americans. Like, can you imagine, for example, the United States ever being able to point to someone, some media figure, and say, you know what? He's the new Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite's dead and gone. There will never be another Walter Cronkite. There will never be another media figure that a majority of Americans has respect for, to the point where every 4 years people say, what would be really great is if Walter Cronkite would run for president. That will never, ever happen again. Never.
Wow. Because there's nobody with that type of integrity in that space anymore. Yeah.
That person doesn't exist.
It's a brand new world. I guess at least we could see it happening, with people like Cy. And I know he's had some success on Substack, which is great. And I always love talking to him. He's my only guest that rocks in a rocking chair while he talks, and it doesn't matter because everyone watches him. So look, that's great to see. Just to finish, how do you think this plays out with Russia? Like, what do you think happens, especially if you take it all the way up to the election?
At the CIA, in our analysis, we used to use this term all the time, muddling through. So many people just naturally, their brain defaults to an either or choice when they try to prognosticate. And oftentimes what was true was that the parties in a conflict just sort of muddled through, and things just didn't change over the medium term. And I think that that's what we're looking at here. The Russians aren't going to use nuclear weapons. I don't think they'll even use tactical nuclear weapons, because they'll lose the propaganda advantage of saying, look, the only country in the history of the planet that's ever used nuclear weapons is the United States. And they did it.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.